The Octatrack from Elektron is a sampler and a sequencer and an all-around very powerful, very complicated piece of equipment. But in this video, I'm going to show you 5 ways you can use it as an instrument to be creative without being complicated for the sake of complicated. My first piece of advice is to start small. When I was teaching myself how to use the Octatrack, the best thing I did was I just set up a new project and a new set that were empty, and I loaded in one sample. And I found it much easier to make heads or tails of what the buttons did, and I even found it easier to start having ideas and be creative when I was working in a literally empty project with only one sample in it. They give you a project when you get it called presets, and the manual sort of takes you through that as like the starting point. I actually found that too complicated. That was like too much happening. I found that overwhelming. It wasn't until I just gave myself literally one sample in an empty project that I started to feel like I was getting it. And the sample doesn't even need to be good. In my case, because I like fake trash, I just loaded a sample that was a recording of one MIDI note from GarageBand. Okay, so I brought that recording of a single MIDI piano note into the Octatrack. The first thing I did was I put it in keyboard mode, or I guess they call it chromatic mode. You hold function and you push the down arrow, and then that just turns the 16 trigger buttons at the bottom into like keyboard buttons. So you can now play that sample like it's an instrument. And then what I did was I started hunting through the effects. I was running that note on a flex machine, and that gives you 2 effect slots. And the discoveries I made were, first, there's a spatializer effect that's supposed to do this like stereo chorus thing, but if you turn it all the way up to like maximum power, you can bring it to the brink of delay. There almost starts to be this little kind of weird delay there that I liked. And then for my second effect slot, I wanted to sort of bring that out more. So I ran into a compressor and I just smashed it as hard as I could. I turned up the compressor crazy high. I was trying to have it grab that like fake delay note from the spatializer and bring that out, and then also just like feed on the decay of my piano note. Those 2 effects hit as hard as I was hitting them, turned that single note into a pretty cool lead instrument just by itself. Okay, the next thing I did was, instead of using a single note, I decided to have my sample be a major chord. So I played a C major bar chord on my guitar, and I ran into a reverb that would like infinitely reverberate it. I was using the Alexander Space Force. I just played a single major C bar chord and let the reverb like hold that, and then I imported that as my sample. And this time I ran it into the Octatrack's actual delay effect, which I found was just like very good at grabbing the like initial transients of my chord and just like operating on that. There's something cool about the delay in here that can just sort of like grab the strumminess of it and do wonders with that. And then I was also running it through a little bit of the lo-fi effect. That gives you a little bit of distortion and a little bit of bit crushing, and that also added to some of the like snap, crackle, and pop of the sample. And those 2 effects on a major chord, again, that's just an instant gold mine. Now, you might have noticed that even though my sample was a major chord, I was using it to play some minor chords in that song you just heard. And the way I was able to do that is you can make a major triad sound like something else if you put it over a different bass note. So even though I only had a major triad all over my little Octatrack keyboard, even though I could only play major triads, if you put it over the right bass note, you can actually make it sound like a minor chord. I'm going to make a whole separate video where I talk about this, but the basic trick is like, you know, if you play a G major triad and then you make the bass note an E, your ear will sort of hear the whole thing as an E minor 7 chord. Yeah, all right. Okay, for the next pro tip, I stuck with the major chord sample, but this time I went into the like SRC screen and started the sample late. So it was starting after the strum, which made it end up sounding more like an organ. And then I ran into the bit crusher again and cranked up the bit crusher really hard. And then the coolest thing I did was that I discovered that the plate reverb in the Octatrack has like a weird gate function built into it. And so I tried to abuse the gate function on the plate reverb. And that ended up giving it this like very bizarre like failure sound. Like it couldn't decide whether to gate or not gate my signal. I tried to dial it in right to the edge of that. And that plus the lo-fi distortion thing, that ended up being a really cool sound. But before I show you what I did with that, there's another thing we got to talk about, which is that I got my Octatrack from Buy or Borrow. Buy or Borrow is a monthly subscription service you could join that lets you borrow any gear you want, synthesizers, pedals, whatever. You sign up, they send it to you, you keep it, you do whatever you need with it, then you send it back and you get the next thing on your list and they'll send you that. And if you decide you want to buy any of the gear you've borrowed, you can. You could buy it from them at a discount. Money. And if you want to sign up now, you can use the promotional code CYBERATTACK to get 20% off your first month. Okay, here's what I did with pro tip number 3. For my next pro tip, I went back to my single note sample. This time, I ran it through the bit crusher again. I got hooked on the bit crusher. But the discovery I made was that there's a retrigger parameter. And if you turn that up, every time you trigger the sample, it'll just trigger over and over again. And at first, I thought that was kind of dumb. But then I realized the cool way to use that is to like set it up so that the retrigger time is randomly changing. And that's cool. That actually has what I consider to be like the Chase Bliss pedal sound. It's got this like chaotic attack that I loved. And the way to make this happen is set the retrigger time to be something kind of short, like 0.4 maybe, and then set up an LFO, have the LFO control retrigger time, and then set the LFO wave shape to random. For my last pro tip, I brought in a new sample. I brought in this from Sonic the Hedgehog 3. I think that's the sound from when you go into the bonus level and you like enter the slot machine. Okay, so I brought in that sample and I found a way to use it to create these larger random chord clusters that are awesome. And this is a little complicated, but you got to stick with me because this is the coolest thing in the video. First, what I did was I put that sample on a flex machine, and then I set up a pattern where every single trigger was firing to play that one sample. But each trigger only had a 20% chance of actually playing the note. And the way you do that is when you are assigning your trigger, you just hold the button down, and then you got to push left arrow, and that'll bring up a screen where if you scroll through it, it'll start to show you different percentage numbers, and that's where you can choose the percentage chance of it actually playing the thing or not. So every trigger was assigned that one sonic note, but each one only had a 20% chance of firing. This is what that sounds like. Okay, what's the big deal? Well, then I assigned the same sample to 3 more tracks, and I did the exact same thing with all those other tracks. So each one was triggering on every single 16th note at a 20% chance of actually making noise or not. But I pitch shifted each track to be different so that altogether those 4 different notes would create one major chord. Okay, then I took everything we've just done to this point and saved it as a part. The Octatrack lets you save settings as parts, and it gives you 4 that are easy to switch between. So I saved everything we just did as part 1, and then I went back and changed all the pitch shifts and reassigned the different pitch shifts on my 4 tracks to make a completely different chord. And I saved that setting as part 2. So now I can flip easily back and forth between those 2 settings anytime I change the part, and they make it easy to change parts. So now I can actually start to convey chord changes with my little random sonic chord clusters. I can actually hit chord changes by switching between parts. And I made a little song with that. But before I play it for you, there's another thing we got to talk about, which is that I got a lot of help making this video from my friend Liam Lizzy, who you might have heard of because he has his own YouTube channel, his own Instagram account, where he does a lot of synthesizer tutorials. That guy helped me understand a lot of what I was trying to do, so I got to thank him. And I also got to tell you that if you want help with your synthesizer stuff, his tutorials are extremely good. I'll put links to his accounts in the video description, but the bonus pro tip here is just you want to check out Liam Lizzy because that guy's ability to explain this stuff is a miracle. Okay, here's what I did by switching parts to change chords with my little Sonic the Hedgehog chord clusters.